Thank you for listening to WAIF Cincinnati 88.3 FM. You're listening to Waves of the New Age this afternoon. Waves of the New Age is made possible in part by the Conscious Living Center, supporting people on their journey of well-being with counseling, coaching, workshops, and the School of Conscious Living. The Enneagram is used for our work in self-understanding, compassion, and transformation. More information about the Conscious Living Center can be found at www.goconscious.com. I just want to again express our support for our gratitude for the Conscious Living Center's support of our program. If you're interested in becoming an underwriter, you can contact us at 513-749-1444. Mr. Gregg Braden is on the program with me this afternoon. Greg, are you there?
I am here. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you wonderfully. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to kind of, go a little deeper into what we spoke about the first time. How's your day going today?
Oh, my day is going really, actually my whole 2012 is going really well. The first 9 days have gone very well, and I just sent a letter out to our entire email and Facebook list, and the essence of that letter is that I really have never felt more optimistic about our world than I do right now at the beginning of this 2012 year. And I think one of the reasons for that is because everything is in flux. And when it's in flux, that is the opportunity for change. If everything is settled and buttoned down, it's very difficult to create change. When all the systems are very intact. Right now, the systems are falling apart. And I think our listeners, if you're listening to this program, are very aware of that, particularly the economic system, which is a reflection of a way of thinking that ties into many of the other things that are very important in our lives every day. So I think we're all going to have a really big year, and I think for people that are holding on to ideas of the world that has been and are working to get back to that world, I think there probably is going to be a lot of disappointment. I think for people that are open to embracing new ways of living, recognizing that the old ones were no longer sustainable, I think this is going to be a tremendous year of opportunity. So that's a long answer to a short question.
No, that's great. The long answers are the best, filled with lots of good information. So what do you think the attachment is to the old system? Do you believe that there's a real desire for things to stay the same, or is that a fear-based reaction?
I think it's all people know, Tara, in all honesty. It can be fear, maybe subconscious fear, but I think for many people it's all they know. And can I share just a brief story? I shared it in the book about this very concept, and sometimes stories are the best way to illustrate the idea. So are you okay?
Yes. Oh, I love stories on this program.
Well, if I do that, and this, I may have shared this with some of your listeners in the past, but it was a conversation that I was having with my mom not long ago, my little 4'8" tall mom, who is she's having some health challenges right now. And for listeners that saw the movie The Bucket List, I was late in seeing that movie. I saw it on an airplane, probably a year and a half after it came out. And I came home and asked my mom, I think most of your listeners are probably familiar, The Bucket List is Morgan Freeman, Jack Nicholson, both facing the end of their lives, realizing and recognizing there are things they hadn't accomplished. And the movie is about them helping one another to fulfill those dreams and wishes before they pass from this world. It's a beautiful, very touching movie. Mm-hmm. And funny. So I came home and I asked Mom, I said, do you have a bucket list? And she said, yeah. And she shared with me the things that she never got to do. And I said, well, let's go. Let's start right now. And she said, well, not yet. And I said, well, why? And she said, well, let's wait till things settle down. And I said, well, what do you mean by settle down? She says, wait till things get back to normal. And I said, normal? She goes, yeah, like the way they were 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And I think a lot of people kind of sense that the world was kind of moving along in a certain way, at a certain pace. A lot of things happened, and for many people, it was all right around 9/11. The world kind of got turned upside down. And many people sense, and not just in this country, I hear this from people all over the world, sense that we're trying to find the new norm, and we're trying to get back to some semblance of normalcy. And what I have to say to those people, and my mom, both, is that world is gone. The world of the past is gone. We have created, as individuals and as societies, ways of thinking, ways of living. Some of them have served us better than others. And the world that we have today is a consequence of the choices that we've made based in the ways of thinking of the past. The best minds of our time are telling us in very clear terms that we, this generation, our time in history, that we're facing the greatest number of crises, major magnitude crises, ever to face a single generation in all of recorded human history. And those crises, if we look closely, it's not the whole world that's falling apart, but the systems that are, and the systems that are falling apart, are the systems that are no longer sustainable in the world that we have in front of us right now. The systems may have worked in the past, but those systems, the economic systems, for example, that are collapsing right now, the way that we share energy, the power grid of the earth, the way that we share resources, the way that we deal with disappearing resources like fresh water and shortages of food and medicine, and the way that we deal with climate change. Do we try to blame one another and think that we can stop it, or do we recognize it's part of a natural cycle and adapt to it and help one another preserve our ways of indigenous life, for example, as we're moving into it? So those are small examples of the kinds of things that I'm talking about, but the key is that the world of the past, it's all about the way we think of it, Tara, and I think for some people, they cling to that world, and they're working to prop up old and unsustainable ways of living and thinking. And those are the people that are experiencing, I think, a lot of frustration right now. And we're seeing it in the political climate as well, in the election cycle, and the things that our leaders are saying to us. And for other people, they recognize that those ways of thinking and living, a big learning curve. We've learned a lot, and it's brought us to the point where we are now, where we can make new choices. And I think that's what this 2012 window of opportunity is all about. In the letter that I sent out recently to our readers, there was at the very end of the letter, as I was thinking about what I would say to all of those people if they were in a live audience in front of me, I think the big question that we're all asking ourselves, it's a shift. It's a subtle shift from asking the question, what can I get from the world that exists today, to changing our thinking and asking, what can I contribute to the world that's emerging today? And the way we answer that question, I think, is the template for much of the experience that we will experience personally and collectively as we go into the changes, continue with the changes that we're all seeing in our world today.
Mm-hmm. So that sentiment that you just expressed about the how can I contribute, that sort of speaks into the area where we kind of left off during the last time that we spoke. You were talking about the deep truth that nature does not work by the theory survival of the fittest or survival of the strongest, but rather through cooperation. So it's not by competition, but rather by cooperation that the species survive. So that's sort of the connection about what you're saying right now, that question to ask ourselves, how can I contribute? How can I best cooperate with others to move this new system forward? Is that what you would say?
I think so, yeah. And I know some of our listeners today were with us in the last program, and some were not. And for those that were not, and Tara, you have to forgive me, I could not hear any introduction, so I don't know what you said before I came on and said hello. That I didn't get to hear any of that today. So if I'm being redundant, I apologize.
No, that's okay. I did introduce you earlier in the program, so our listeners are familiar with who you are.
In the last program, the book, the most recent book, Deep Truth, Igniting the Memory of Our Origin, History, Destiny, and Fate, examines the crises that the best minds of our time tell us that we face and that we must solve quickly, and the thinking that led to the crises. And much of the thinking in the Western world is based upon the ideas of what is considered to be modern science, science from the last 300 years, from the time of Isaac Newton forward. And the way that we solve these crises is determined by the way we think of ourselves and our relationship to the world. And much of that comes from assumptions that science has made. And the last time that we did this program, I identified 5 false assumptions of science. And you just listed one of them. What I'd like to do for those that may not be familiar with them, let me just state them again, and then we can tie into them however we'd like to for the rest of this program. Are you okay if I do it that way?
That would actually be perfect, because last time we didn't have an opportunity to get to all 5 of them. So that actually is a hole I really wanted to fill this time around. We mostly stayed on that first point.
Well, there are many false assumptions that science has made. So I'm going to begin by saying that I was trained as a scientist. I think science is good. Science has certainly served us. We have better lives, a better world, because of some scientific discoveries on the one hand. And on the other hand, science doesn't have all the answers. It is a relatively new way, only 300 years old. It's a new way of thinking of our world. And there are glaring gaps and inconsistencies in our scientific understanding. The world that we know today is what it is because of choices that we've made in the last 300 years, largely based on scientific assumptions. New discoveries are telling us that many of those assumptions are false. So what I'd like to do is identify 5 key assumptions, and then we can talk about the discoveries that tell us they're false, whichever ones we'd like to go into.
Perfect.
So I'll just state these. The first key assumption, and by the way, these are being taught, they were taught to me when I was in school. When you were in school, I'm sure you were taught, unless you were very fortunate to be in a progressive school system that was looking at new discoveries. Most of our listeners, they're young people, are being taught these 5 false assumptions today. So the first one is a Darwinian assumption about evolution. The first key assumption, false assumption, is that evolution explains life in general and human life specifically. The second false assumption is that civilization itself is only about 5,000 years old. It began in the time of ancient Sumeria and Mesopotamia. The third false assumption is that consciousness is somehow separate from our physical world. And the fourth false assumption is that the space between things is empty. So the space between the nucleus of an atom and the first electron, or the space between you and the person next to you, that space is empty. That's a false assumption. And the fifth you just identified is another Darwinian assumption, is that nature is based upon an idea that Darwin stated. This is the Darwinian term, survival of the strongest. It was later interpreted as survival of the fittest. Every one of those assumptions is scientifically proven in peer-reviewed documents, peer-reviewed papers that have been accepted in the specific scientific communities. Every one of these is absolutely false. And new discoveries have proven to us that they're false. However, there is a reluctance, and in some cases, Tara, an outright resistance to share the new discoveries in mainstream media, mainstream documentaries, mainstream classrooms, and mainstream textbooks. So the net result is that our young people are faced with a lifetime ahead of them where the best minds of our time are telling us that we have the greatest crises of recorded human history, and they're being asked to solve those crises through the thinking that led to the crises, and they're not being allowed the new discoveries that empower them with additional ways of thinking of our world. So maybe if we don't want to replace the teaching of these, we could at least share the new discoveries alongside the existing assumptions so that young people know that these exist, that they do exist.
Sure, and that's part of your personal mission, what you're out to do. I mean, we spoke last time about the kind of like the sense of urgency behind all of this, that we're really running out of time and we don't have the luxury of, waiting for what you termed lag time, that 5 to 8 year adjustment when, the world kind of gets used to a new system and implements new ideas.
Absolutely. And traditionally, in academic circles, there is an accepted lag time between the time a new discovery is made, it's confirmed, it's verified, it is checked out through peer-reviewed publications, and finally, when it trickles down into the classrooms and textbooks, it's actually 8 to 10 years. So that traditionally happens anyway. But what we're seeing now is actually a reluctance, and in some cases it is very clearly a resistance to sharing the new material because it upsets a traditional way of thinking. There's a scientific story about us and our relationship to the world that's been taught for over 150 years in the case of the Darwinian theories. Think of how many textbooks have been printed and how much curricula has been developed. Entire careers are based upon sharing and perpetuating that story. And I can understand where that reluctance would come from on the one hand, and on the other hand, what scientists today are telling us is we've got a relatively small window of time to solve some of these problems, some of them within the next 18 to 24 months. Mm-hmm. Decisions of what will happen of the global economy and decisions regarding the war, the big war that's brewing in the Middle East right now. Those decisions are being made in the next 18 to 24 months. Those two arenas, in and of themselves, global economics and how we solve those problems in the Middle East, they will shape the fate of our world from this point forward. And there is a thinking based in the false assumptions of science. This is going to zero right in. Both of those crises stem directly from the idea that nature is based on survival of the strongest. Our corporations have been built based upon this idea. The global economic system is based upon this idea, and the global power structure is based upon this idea. And if we want to know where this false assumption will lead, we look at what the consequences are. We're living those consequences today. And if we try to solve the problems with the same thinking, believing that survival of the strongest is the law of nature, using that to justify the thinking that led to the greatest suffering of the 20th century and the greatest wars in recorded human history, then we know where that's going to get us. New peer-reviewed studies, over 400 studies, Tara, were done in the late 1990s, early 2000s, exploring the role of competition and cooperation. And the question was asked, what is the optimum amount of competition in any given species? And when they talk about competition, it's not like a friendly game of soccer or a friendly game of checkers. This is violent competition. 400 peer-reviewed studies all came back with exactly the same answer. Alfie Kahn described this in his book, The Case Against, or No Competition. No Contest, The Case Against Competition. That was the name of his book. 400 studies came back, and they all had the same answer. They said zero competition is optimum. Always, always, always. Competition is detrimental to the individual, to the community. It's detrimental to the classroom. It's detrimental in the workplace. And the journal New Scientist, April of 2008, Michael LePage came out with an amazing peer-reviewed article in that journal. It was April 16th, 2008. Evolution Myth, Survival of the Fittest. And what he said, and this is a quote, he says, what we see in the wild is not every animal for itself. Cooperation, he says, is an incredibly successful survival strategy. When cooperation breaks down, the results can be disastrous. And I think we're witnessing a world where cooperation, we have bought into the idea of survival of the strongest. So the business models of corporations are based upon that. The global economic system that's collapsing right now is based upon that. Our young people in the classroom are steeped in the belief that the bottom line Getting the right answer is the goal. It's not about what they become in achieving that. It's not about their excellence. It's about getting the right answer, competing with everyone else to be better than everyone else in that way. So this idea of survival of the strongest, it is a false assumption. It's led to some of the greatest suffering, and it was actually used to justify some of the greatest atrocities of humans against humans in the 20th century, continuing into the 21st century. And this is one of those false assumptions, and the consequences. People say, well, Greg, what difference does it make? These are Darwinian ideas. They were put forth 1859. We're in the modern 21st century world. What difference could it possibly make? And the answer is it makes a huge difference, because we are living in a civilization and systems that are steeped, either consciously or subconsciously, in this belief of survival of the strongest, competition versus cooperation. And that's only one of the 5 false assumptions. So this is the one I think that's wreaking the most havoc in our world today, and it ties right into the question that you just asked.
Well, let me ask you to paint a picture for us of what a different world would look like. What would our classrooms look like based on the new model? And, you mentioned 2 of the largest looming problems that, will need to be addressed in the next 18 to 24 months, the global economic system and the war in the Middle East. So can you share with us a little bit about your solutions?
Yeah, well, based on this false assumption of science, the belief is that war is good for the economy. So the two kind of go hand in hand. And there are a lot of people that believe, a good war in the Middle East is going to fuel a lot of industry and put a lot of people back to work and solve a lot of the problems. What the studies show very clearly is that peace is a viable industry, and that there's much more opportunity that comes from, and much less suffering that comes from the world of peace than there does from the world of war. But we're conditioned to believe that war is the viable industry. I don't really see anyone exploring peace right now on the mainstream stage as a viable industry. Our young people in school, what would it look like? Realistically, I don't think that the Darwinian ideas are going to disappear overnight. But I think, to be fair to our young people, it's important to share with them all of the information, and to say that, in addition to the Darwinian ideas, there are other theories, alternate theories, that discoveries now suggest, and let them know that cooperation is now being accepted on a greater and greater level as the law, if you will, of nature. Right now, our young people don't get any of that. In the United States, college professors and some high school professors are actually losing their jobs if they even mention the fact that there are alternative theories that might compete with Darwinian ideas. So, what are we afraid of? I mean, our young people are smart. They are on the verge of dedicating their lives to solving the problems that we leave behind, and they're being asked to solve those problems within the confines of the false assumptions that led to the problems to begin with. So I think a classroom would look a little different if at least the alternative theories, and they have to be good, scientifically proven, peer-reviewed theories. If those theories are shared, to give our young people the big picture. And on the global stage, I think what's happening right now is that the changes of our world are so great that they are going to force us into greater levels of personal and international cooperation just to solve the problems. Climate change is a perfect example. The false assumptions of science have stated categorically that humans caused global warming. That is an absolutely false assumption. As a geologist, I can tell you the ice cores of Antarctica in Greenland, when we look at those ice cores back 420,000 years, Tara, what we see are very clear cycles of warming and cooling, about 100,000 years different. But the kicker, and I have this information and actually the charts in the new book, in Deep Truth, The kicker is that the temperatures always warm before the gases increase, rather than the gases increasing to cause the warming. So two things, that tells us two things. First of all, because CO2 levels did rise hundreds of thousands of years in the past, presumably we weren't living here then, so we weren't the cause of the CO2 levels. So that has happened in the past, and the fact that the temperatures rise first and then the greenhouse gases rise is in direct competition with the story that's being shared in the mainstream today. Now, I have to be very clear when I talk about this. Clearly, we need to clean up our act. We need to find green, sustainable, non-carbon-based ways to fuel our planet. We need to find these new sustainable forms of energy. The consequence of leading people to believe that humans cause global warming is that it creates a lot of bad feelings. The Climate Change Summit, Copenhagen in 2010, is a perfect example, where leaders of the world came together. We had for a week with high hopes that the leaders themselves were in the room, eye to eye, face to face, that they would come together and come up with some viable options to help us deal with climate change. But the reality, here's what happened. Based on the false assumptions of science, the leaders believed the assumptions that humans caused the warming. And what happened at that climate change summit was essentially it broke down into a finger-pointing summit of blame of which nations were more responsible than other nations, and trying to assign a financial penalty to those nations to clean it up. And the whole thing fell apart. It's very, very hard to work together in an environment of blame, because the blame fosters hard feelings. So what I see, what could have happened is this. Those leaders could have come together and they could have said, look, climate change is a fact. We know it's happening. We don't fully understand it. The evidence suggests it's happened in the past. We have certainly contributed to it, and I agree we've contributed to some degree, but we didn't cause it. So they could have said, we've contributed to it. We're probably not going to stop it because it's part of a natural cycle. Let's work together to help our nations and our communities to adapt to the change that is creating, superstorms, destroying entire coastal communities and ways of life. Let's adapt. Let's work together and adapt to this rare phenomenon. And because of that, we'll become better people and have stronger bonds between nations. That could have happened. Mm-hmm. The reality, what did happen, is what I mentioned before, the belief that certain nations were more responsible than others for climate change, and the finger pointing, and then trying to assign, if you can imagine, trying to assign a dollar value to how much damage is being done, and that really fosters a hard feeling that makes cooperation very difficult. Mm-hmm. So that's an example of where that's a delicate topic of conversation, but I'm bringing it up now because it is also going to be a conversation of this presidential election cycle coming up this year. So we're going to see a lot of data being thrown around, and I think it's very important to step back, look at the big picture, and give ourselves the facts of climate change. And the facts don't jive with what mainstream is hearing right now.
I think it's amazing how the macrocosm always reflects the microcosm, and it's so elementary. If you were to ask someone, how do things operate in a one-on-one relationship, with each other, someone would say absolutely, blaming the other person never works. That's never going to provide a good outcome.
Absolutely. And what really, even though I can usually intellectually grasp some of these concepts when I'm reading them in the scientific journals, what really sealed the deal for me on cooperation was an example that probably a lot of us don't think about, and that is the human body. We think we're individuals, but as scientists like Dr. Bruce Lipton, my dear friend and colleague, will tell us, we're actually a community of individual cells, about 50 trillion cells, and those cells must work in cooperation for us to have healthy, viable lives. And when that cooperation breaks down, what we have is illness and disease. That's what cancer is all about. Cells not working together. So when I really began to understand that, and then looked back into history, cells and life had to work together in what are called symbiotic relationships for the world to evolve, life to evolve the way that it has. And evolution is a fact. In the past, the evidence suggests evolution is a fact for life, but the evidence very clearly shows that it doesn't support the origins of human life. There's something very mysterious happening when it comes to humans. But cooperation is being key throughout the development of life. So before we go any further, Tara, I just want to ask, did I do okay with the climate change? Did I leave any lingering doubt? And I say it frequently, and if people have never heard of it, is there anything that you think I should clarify?
I think you did a beautiful job, and that, in fact, I'm really excited to move on to some of these other assumptions.
Sure.
I'm really anxious to dig into the, a false assumption that consciousness is separate from the physical world, as well as the idea that the space between things is empty. But
Sure.
before I ask you to answer that, I do want to remind our listeners that they're listening to WAIF Cincinnati 88.3 FM. Thank you for tuning in this afternoon. You're listening to Tara Robinson during the interview with best-selling author Gregg Braden. His newest release is titled Deep Truth, and we are exploring the concepts in that book this afternoon. Thank you for tuning in to WAIF 88.3 FM. Remember, you can also listen online via streaming audio, which reaches all over the world at www.waif883.org. Okay, Greg, so go ahead. Let's dig into the idea of consciousness and the space between things.
Well, these two are actually related, and they're obviously talking about physics. If our listeners are with us today, I'm sure they are familiar with the term in physics, the unified field theory, the elusive unified field theory that physicists have been searching for over 100 years now. The scientific story that weaves together all of the forces of nature into a way that makes sense and describes our relationship to that. That theory is elusive. There are a lot of ideas that are floating around out there, such as the superstring theory. I'm sure people have heard of and the string theories and some of those. All of them have come essentially to a dead end. There hasn't been a lot of... there are new discoveries refining the existing ideas, but the big discoveries that bridge these concepts have been very elusive. And I think the reason is, and what our own scientists now are beginning to suspect, is because we have written consciousness right out of the equation. Princeton University Professor John Wheeler was one of the pioneers of physics in the 20th century. He was a colleague of Albert Einstein. Actually, he just died. I think he died in 2008. And he was a huge proponent of writing consciousness back into the theories of physics. And what he said, the whole idea in physics is that we somehow can be observers separate from whatever is happening in the universe. What John Wheeler said very clearly is that the word observer should be taken out of the textbooks. He said there are no observers, that when we witness an event happening anywhere in the world, we are part of what it is that we've seen. He said that we should replace the word observer with the word participator. And the physics certainly supports this. On the quantum level, it's been clearly shown, Tara, that when we observe, when we watch quantum particles, they act differently in the presence of us watching than when we're not watching. That they behave differently, that we somehow influence those quantum particles without touching them. The simple act of us observing those particles changes the way they behave. Now, there's no controversy as to whether or not that happens. That's very well accepted in physics books and the physics circles. The controversy is to what degree does that phenomenon play out in our everyday lives, in our everyday world? We are all made of those quantum particles. Our bodies are made of those quantum particles, and our desks and our chairs and our physical world. So the question is, when we observe a quantum particle in the laboratory and we change the way it behaves because we watched it there, does that play out in our everyday lives in terms of the healing of our bodies and the creation of peace in our communities and between nations? This is the controversy right now, and the evidence and pioneers such as John Wheeler strongly support the ideas that we do influence, not control, not manipulate, but we influence the outcome of these physical particles. It's not accounted for in the theories of science right now because all the theories have written consciousness out of the theories. They feel that the physical world is somehow separate from the stuff that's affected by these particles or by consciousness. So it's very interesting because these two, that the space between things is empty and that consciousness is separate from our physical world are actually linked. Consciousness is believed to be the stuff that fills in the space between things. And a series of experiments, and we talk about these in some of the other books, like the Divine Matrix, have shown very, very clearly, these are peer-reviewed scientific experiments, have shown, I'll just go through these experiments very quickly. One of them is showing that in the presence of DNA, human DNA, quantum particles change the way they behave in the presence of human DNA. Okay, so the particles are what the world's made of. The DNA is what we're made of. So the studies are showing that human DNA has a direct influence on the stuff our world is made of. Another study is showing very clearly that human emotion, when we change the way we feel, that we change the DNA that's affecting the stuff our world is made of. And another study is showing that whether it's in the same room or many miles away, distance has no effect, that the phenomenon continues. So when we begin to think about what these discoveries are showing us, they parallel strongly some of our most ancient and cherished spiritual traditions. Mm-hmm. Before science came along, humans were understanding our world in another way, and they knew that when we feel certain feelings in our bodies, that those feelings would affect our bodies and sometimes the physical world around us. So this is where these applications come in. But in this book, in the book Deep Truth, I wanted to stay with the science and only with the peer-reviewed science, not the speculation. The peer-reviewed science is showing us that there is no empty space. There is something everywhere. What we thought was empty space is not empty. It's simply a form of energy that's poorly understood. And that consciousness is the stuff that our physical world is made of. When we go from the gross physical down to the finer energies of quantum particles, this is the stuff that our world is made of, and it's the stuff that our emotions influence. So consciousness actually has a direct influence on the stuff our world is made of.
Can you give what your definition of consciousness is?
I can give I can give a very good definition. Consciousness is the stuff that everything is made of. There is nothing. What the studies are showing, what the new theories are suggesting, is that everything is consciousness. Different levels, different refinements of consciousness, but consciousness is the stuff. Once we allow for the energy of consciousness to be present in the equations that try to unify everything else, those equations begin to work much better. So consciousness is the stuff that everything arises from, that physical matter arises from.
So is the consciousness itself is it physical matter on a very, very small scale?
It's what precedes physical matter. So it is the energy that can become physical matter.
Okay.
if that makes sense. For people who would like to see the peer-reviewed studies and the experiments, the book, The Divine Matrix, was released, I think it was released in 2007, and it has the bibliography itself is probably worth the price of the book, the research that went into that. But clearly the science, what's happening is individual realms of science are exploring, like biophysics, for example, or some of them are happening in Russia, some of the studies are happening in the United States, some of them are happening in Sweden and Switzerland and places like that. The individual studies are peer-reviewed. What has not happened is the studies have not been brought together to create the story. So there are very good studies showing that human emotion changes the DNA. It changes the shape, the physical shape in our bodies, and the way the DNA behaves in our bodies. Those studies those are peer-reviewed studies. Other studies are showing that quantum particles, when they are separated by a distance of miles, when one particle is forced to behave one way, its twin particle miles away behaves the same way. That means they're still connected even though they're physically separate. Those studies are very, very clearly showing us this. The fact that human emotion influences quantum particles, those studies are very clearly showing us that the relationships exist. What the reluctance is to bring all of those together into the picture that helps us to understand our relationship to the world. And while that's changing, that's what there's a reluctance to share those kinds of studies in mainstream classrooms and textbooks.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned a few moments ago about the application of these new findings and understandings. So when it comes to the area of consciousness mm-hmm. being the energy that gives rise to physical matter that precedes mm-hmm. The physicality of something. So what do we then do with that information?
Well, we can do whatever we choose to do with the information. What it tells us, the modern medical model that most of us are familiar with, tends to separate us from our bodies. So if you ask a doctor, how should you think or feel about the healing of your body, they'll, more often than not, they'll tell you that what you think and feel isn't going to make any difference unless you have a doctor who's open to the new studies and what the new science is showing. There is a new science emerging, however, and it is a bona fide science that is called epigenetics. Mm-hmm. When I was in school, I was taught that the genes control our bodies and that DNA controls our bodies. And while the DNA certainly influences what's happening in our bodies, what the studies are showing is that the DNA receives its instructions from somewhere else. So those instructions can be from emotions, they can be from the physical environment, or they can be from chemicals that we put into our bodies. But all of those influence the DNA that tells our bodies what to do. I remember when my mother right now her health is failing in some respects, and I am responsible for her in her daily affairs and in her health. And when I took her to a recent doctor's appointment, a very well-known clinic here in the States, and I was asking about supplements. What kinds of supplements would help my mom for the condition she's experiencing right now? What the doctor told me was essentially I'd be wasting my money on supplements because their training is that the body is a machine and these parts are separate from one another and certainly separate from us. And they work until they break, and when they break, you can replace them sometimes. But the idea that we somehow participate in maintaining the quality of the cells in our bodies, while many of our listeners are certainly on board with that, a lot of mainstream doctors and very well-known clinics are not. So they're very good for diagnosis, and that was the primary reason for me using this particular clinic. It was really good. Can't beat Western medicine for diagnosis. But once you find out what's going on, to me it makes a lot of sense to marry that diagnosis with 5,000 years proven applications from many traditions and cultures that help our bodies to strengthen and sustain the function of our bodies in ways that Western medicine often doesn't even recognize right now. I have to be careful when I say that, because there are some doctors, of course, that are open to the new ideas. They're called holistic MDs, for example, and it is changing, but it's changing much quicker in some places than others here in Western traditions.
So just to kind of more fully be able to get our arms around these concepts, it makes sense. I think, most of us or all of us are aware that we can make choices about our emotions, and that we can, choose and manipulate our emotions and our feelings, to some extent. We don't have to just be victims or bystanders of our emotions. But consciousness is sort of another matter. So do you believe that we have some control and influence over consciousness itself? And you mentioned, that it gives rise to the physical matter, and that everything is sort of on a different level of consciousness. Sure. So can we, is that level pretty much set, or can we affect the level of the consciousness of something?
This is one of those places, Tara, where it may not even do justice to the topic to talk about this, because there's so many things we have not covered that pave the way for the conversation. And having said that, we are having the conversation. So what I'd like to say is this: we could think of consciousness as the medium that we influence. Consciousness is the medium that we influence, that gives rise to our experience, whether it's the condition of our body, or the peace at the family dinner table, or the peace between nations. So consciousness is the medium. The emotions are what we have absolute ability to participate in, choosing what kinds of emotions we create in our bodies to be expressed in the medium. Does that make sense?
Yes,
okay.
It absolutely
So it's not that we're controlling consciousness. We can think of consciousness simply as a reflective screen, and that's actually the way it's described in some of the theoretical journals. It's the medium, the whiteboard or the screen that reflects in the stuff that makes up our world what we claim to be true within our bodies, within our hearts, within our thoughts, feelings, emotions, and beliefs. So our bodies are the outpicturing, and the circumstances of our lives are the outpicturing, individually and collectively. So that is another way. In other words, and the way I describe this in the book, The Divine Matrix, is we are both the art as well as the artist. So we are the artist that is always creating, but we are also the art that's been created. We're both participating and experiencing in what it is and we're creating all the time. So we're renewing and creating the health of our bodies, and that's why it's important not to buy into. I had a friend recently who went to a doctor, a medical doctor, and the medical doctor just flat out told my friend that she didn't have much longer in this world. And once we hear something like that, it sets into motion a series of events, because we have heard that from someone that we trust, someone that we believe in, and depending on how we interpret that, some people just give up and they lose hope. They say, the doctor says it's all over. I think what a doctor can say honestly is a doctor can say, in this moment, this is what your body is showing us, and your body is constantly renewing itself, and you have the ability to support that renewal. Let's explore what that looks like. That is another way. It's a very honest way of saying, acknowledging what the body is showing right now, but not buying in to the outcome of continuing that experience. if that makes sense.
Absolutely. No, you did an excellent job answering that question. I knew it was a big question, but you did an excellent job of summing it up without having,
It is.
Even though
one of the things, I know my sense is our time's passing quickly, and of these key assumptions, there's another one I really want to identify and talk about here, and it's about civilization itself, but it actually ties into all the things that we've talked about today. Are you okay if I do that quickly?
Yes, perfect. And I would love for you to, maybe squeeze in some nuggets about time, since we, have just now entered this, big, era of 2012. I know our listeners would love to hear a little bit about that.
Absolutely. Well, when I was in school, back in the 60s and 70s, probably when you were in school, many of our listeners, and our listeners have young people in school today, we're being taught that civilization itself is only about 5,000, maybe 5,500 years old. That it began in the Mesopotamian Valley, the ancient Sumeria, that it's a one-time deal, it's linear. Began primitive and advanced in a linear fashion to the pinnacle of sophistication and technology that we see today. It's a great story. It makes for a great map in our textbooks. We've all heard it, and the problem is the data doesn't support it. And in the past, my training as a geologist kind of overlapped into some of the archaeological and paleontological studies as well. What we've seen in the past have been discoveries of civilizations, advanced civilizations that didn't fit this model of 5,000 years and a one-time development. And scientists have called them anomalies. And what they do is they tend to put the anomaly in its own category. They say, it doesn't fit the model. Something special happened here. We'll come back and study it later. Well, the problem now, Tara, is that there are so many anomalies that the anomalies are beginning to tell a new story. So 5,000 years is the age of civilization that we're being given today. In the interest of time, I won't be able to go through all the really interesting ones, but I'm going to just say that a number of peer-reviewed scientific discoveries are now showing evidence of advanced civilization in different parts of the world. It's not all at the same place. That is at least twice that old. We're seeing in South America, for example, the oldest civilization in all of the Americas, older than anything, than the Aztec, than the Inca, than the Maya, any of those. I had the opportunity to personally document in June of 2010 north of Lima, Peru. 150-acre site, 5 pyramids, 2 huge circular plazas of mysterious origin. But is now being dated at least 7,000 years old. So that's 2,000 years older than what we have been led to believe. And this civilization collapsed when we're told that civilization began 5,000 years ago. Off the Gulf of Kambat in India, a 5-mile-long, 2-mile-wide city under the water is now being dated right around 9,500, possibly 10,000 years old. And either the city was built underwater, which I have to say as a scientist is possible, although it's not likely, or it was built near the edge of the water and was submerged when the sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age. In Turkey, Çatal Höyük is an archaeological site right around 8,000, 9,000 years old, but the oldest in all of the world right now is a place called Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, and people don't have to write it down. It's all in the new book, including the photographs from the Smithsonian Institution. They gave us permission to share the photographs of this civilization. We don't know who these people were, where they came from. They built temple sites that were intentionally covered to preserve them around 8,000 years ago, but they're now dating over 11,000 years old. So when we look at a geologic map, 11,000 years is right at the end of the last ice age. And when we plug in all of these discoveries, what we find is that the 5,000 years that we're taught is the history of the world that began in ancient Sumeria and Mesopotamia. It's not the history of the whole world forever. It's the history of the most recent 5,000-year cycle described on calendars like the Mayan calendar, for example, and other indigenous calendars. And it does not account for the cycle, the 5,000-year cycle before this current cycle. Our current cycle began in the year 3114 BC, and it ends in December of 2012. It's a cycle that's defined by Earth's position in space and the changes in climate and weather that change the way we live every 5,000 years. So these archaeological sites now are showing us evidence of advanced civilization at least twice as old as what we've been led to believe. Back 10,000 years, the last time Earth went through similar changes. Why is this important? It's important because it tells us that the changes we're living are part of a natural rhythm, a natural cycle that we can learn to adapt to, rather than blaming one another and fighting over. We can learn from the civilizations of the past what worked for them and apply that in our lives today. But the bottom line, the key for me in all of this, and this ties into some of the things that we talked about earlier in this program, is that in all of these civilizations before 5,000 years, so pre-5,000-year civilization, Tara, there is no evidence of large-scale war, no evidence of any weapons have been found, no walls were required to protect the cities, no moats around the homes, no mass graves, no mutilated bodies that you would expect to see as a result of war. We do not see large-scale war as a way of solving our problems until the beginning of the cycle that we're living right now. And I think this is important because we're also being taught that war is as natural as night and day, and that it is human nature to create war. And what this archaeological evidence is suggesting is that war isn't our nature. We can become warlike under certain conditions when resources become scarce and we choose to solve the problems by fighting one another. But it's not our natural condition. And all of these contribute to the lens that helps us to see ourselves, our relationship to the world and one another, and it's that lens that we look through to solve the problems of our time today. And I'm just sensing we're close to the end of our time, and I wanted to kind of bring that all together in that way.
I'm glad you did, and you've done an excellent job. You're right. We only have about 1 minute left, and I know that you have another interview to get to right away, so I do want to make sure to honor your time, but I feel like we have ended this program on such a positive note this afternoon, and that the message is one of hope, and that we're not, doomed to the same, kind of fatal destruction that we see in the civilizations, prior to this most recent 5,000-year cycle. We just need to get in gear and get our heads on straight and our minds and hearts in the right places, I suppose.
I think, I've never been more optimistic about our world and where we are. Because the world is in flux, it opens the door for opportunity and change. And my sense is that when the facts are clear, our choices become obvious. So the purpose of sharing this material is to share the peer-reviewed scientific facts, not the speculation, but the facts of our relationship to our bodies, to the earth, to our past. And from those, I think then people have the tools that they need to make the choices that create the kind of life. In general, I think we're all looking for pretty much the same kind of world.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power.
Yeah.
Right.
I think so. Well, Tara, thank you for being such a gracious host today and having me back so soon. You had me on just a few weeks ago, and you had me back again anyway.
Yes. No, it was great because we just didn't cover near as much material the first time. So this was a really excellent conversation. And Gregg, I wish you the best of luck in the rest of your interviews and journeys this afternoon, and I look forward to crossing paths with you in the near future.
I look forward to that as well. I look forward to the next time, and I want to thank all of our listeners for everything they're doing every moment of every day to make this a better world. We appreciate you tremendously. So take good care.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for tuning in to WAIF Cincinnati 88.3 FM. You are listening to Waves of the New Age this afternoon. I'm your host, Tara Robinson, and I'm just concluding the interview with Gregg Braden this afternoon, which was a very insightful interview. I'm so glad that we had the opportunity to cover the 5 false assumptions and to dispel some of the myths, as, of course, in Gregg Braden style, backed up with scientific evidence. And, peer-reviewed information and discovery. So thank you for tuning in. You're listening to Soul-Filled Sounds and Conscious Conversation. Our program is on every Tuesday from 3 to 5 p.m. So be sure to keep your dial set right here to 88.3 FM in Cincinnati, Ohio. Remember, you can also listen live via streaming audio at www.waif883.org. We are going to bridge the gap now with some music by Mitten and Deva Premal titled Awakening from their Soul and Wonder album. It's one of my favorite songs by them, and I think it's so fitting for what our discussion was this afternoon, awakening to the new discovery so that we can make better choices moving forward in our own lives and, of course, in the world. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the music.